That's what I do too. And then I don't have to worry.
Except for all I'm seeing is my presentation. So how do I get, oh, there, it's up the top. Never mind. I think it is recording.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So let's jump into, so mine is MVC, basically covering, what it is and a couple of examples how to use it. So I wanted to maybe take just a real quick step back and talk a little bit about the history, kind of where did MVC get started? So here's my first ever selfie. Back in the day when I first started programming computers, everything was character-based and programs were monolithic. Everything had to be put into one large self-contained executable, which made it difficult to maintain and modify at times. Both of those factors really constrained what was possible to create in terms of software. And it was in the 70s that folks started to think about maybe different ways of using computers rather than just this character-based interface. And really, it was scientists at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center that did a lot of work that sort of generated what we have today as modern graphical user interfaces. And during that time frame, there was a Norwegian computer scientist. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but he actually formulated the model view controller pattern for graphical user interface software design while he was visiting the Palo Alto Research Center in 1979. It was another 9 years before any of that information was actually published where people could read about it. So it was in August and September of 1988 in the issue of the Journal of Object-Oriented Programming where that information was released. And it kind of got out in the wild from there, and today it's a very widely used design pattern in software development and very common in web application development frameworks. So with that, let's jump into what is MVC. And I will say that all of the code that I'm going to show you is not my code. It's stuff that I found that I felt was very simple and well explained. And I think it was Ryan actually that found this first one, this tutorials point one. So thanks, Ryan, for that.
Yeah.
So, what is a model view controller? It's an architectural pattern that essentially segregates or separates your application into three logical components called the model, the view, and the controller. And each one of those components is supposed to handle specific aspects of an application. So a model basically is the data layer. So all of your data-related logic should be contained in the model. You shouldn't have a view, for example, that has its own data related logic. All of that should reside in the model. The view should be a fairly simple component that contains all of the user interface logic of the application. So the example they give here is that a customer view would include all of the UI components for text boxes, drop downs, etc. that deal with customer information. And then the controller, to me, is pretty self-explanatory. It basically controls the flow of the application. It contains all of the logic, basically, meaning that when a user requests something, that request is going to go to the controller, and the controller is going to decide what it needs to do to fulfill that request. It's going to, pass off that work either to the model to go get some data or update some data, to do what needs to be done from a data operations perspective. And then it's going to pass updated information back to the view to present to the user. So that's kind of the role of the controller. So does that kind of make sense to folks?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep, it does.
Okay. So I think a lot more visually. So I always like, you know, some diagrams to sort of explain stuff. And I saw this visual on the left. Seemed like a lot of different articles kind of had that as their visual of, hey, here's what, you know, model view controller looks like. I don't really like that one because it's not very clear to me. I found another one that to me represents more of sort of a purist view of MVC. And the reason I like the one on the right better is because it sort of shows that, look, the view doesn't actually talk to the model. The view talks to the controller. And the model doesn't talk to the view, it talks to the controller. So it really shows that controller as being actually the controller, right? So stuff has to pass through the controller to get to the other two areas. Any questions on that?
No.
All right. So let's jump into some code. Again, this is from that same Tutorials Point article that Ryan found. The model is basically, I believe, what would be called a POJO, a plain ordinary Java object, that is about the student. And really, it's pretty simple. There's just two attributes to the student, the roll number and the student's name. And so the model then contains the code necessary for that, so things like the setters and the getters. The view, also very simple. And basically, I mean, so this is, you know, just a output to the console where it's going to print out the student's name and roll number. That's the only job of this view component, is to do that. So very simple code there. The controller then is, again, kind of where that logic resides, that kind of decides what to do, you know, and how to interact with the model, how to interact with the view. So in here, you can see that the code is instantiating a model object, and it's instantiating a view object, and then it's doing things like you know, setting the student name, getting the student name, setting the roll number, getting the roll number, and updating the view, that very last method, update view, which then calls the code from that view object. So this one, I don't, you know, I think it might take a little bit of time to kind of read through, study, figure it out in terms of each of these different methods. But again, because this is from that Tutorials Point article, I didn't want to take the time to really review it in detail today. So then what we need is basically just some brief application code to run those other classes that we've just looked at. And so this class, MVC Pattern Demo, basically has the main, and in there it starts by, you know, creating an instance of the model, creating an instance of the view, and then an instance of the controller. And then it updates the model data by, you know, setting a student name of John, and then it updates the view. And then in this method, retrieve student from database, it sets a different student name of Robert and a roll number of 10. So what it's actually doing here is, you know, up here, it's creating that controller object. Up here at the very beginning, it's creating an instance of that model. That's actually where it's then going to call this method here. So the very first thing, even though it's last in the code, the very first thing that's going to happen is that this student object is going to get created and populated with a name of Robert and a roll number of 10. And then as we drop down through the code, this update view should print out that name and roll number to the screen. Then it's going to call this controller method, set student name of John, and it's going to update the view. So what we should see then is it should show John with a roll number of 10. It's not necessarily super intuitive, I didn't think, but hopefully I've kind of explained what you're going to see. Does that make sense, or am I confusing people?
That makes sense.
Okay. So this is just a screenshot of the code running in my IntelliJ, and you can see down at the bottom, it prints out the name Robert, the roll number 10, and then the name John and the roll number 10, which again sort of fits what we just saw in the code. So just validating that the output there is kind of what we would expect. So, you know, in this code, it's all console output based. There's no graphical user interface of any sort. Very simple and doesn't do very much, right? But it should sort of illustrate how it's using those different components. The model, which does any of the, you know, data related stuff. The view, which simply just outputs this stuff to the console, and the controller that sort of dictates, you know, what is going to happen in terms of calling the model, calling the view. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so then I wanted to show another use of the pattern. This one involves Java Servlet application, and it's very similar in that it just uses a simple student object sort of model. It doesn't do anything super useful, but I think that, you know, in trying to sort of demonstrate what a pattern does, the simpler that we can get with these things, the easier it is. And then once you kind of get familiar with it, you can kind of build out from there in terms of complexity. So this code came from this beldung.com site, which I've included the URL there. Before we jump into that, I wanted to kind of lay some groundwork here. So how many of you guys took CIT 336 or have done anything with PHP?
Yes, I have.
I took CIT 260, but nothing with PHP.
Okay. So I don't know how relevant this will be for you folks that haven't used PHP, but essentially the diagram on the left kind of shows you've got your client, that's your web browser. It's going to talk to Apache, which is the web server. But Apache, you can install PHP on top of Apache, and then in your web pages, you can have PHP code mingled in with HTML code. And you know, when it retrieves that file from the file system, it interprets PHP on the fly. PHP is an interpreted language, and it interprets the PHP, and the resulting output is going to be basically all HTML, right? So what the browser sees is just HTML, even though in the file itself that is that page, it has PHP code. It's because this PHP engine in the middle is interpreting that on the fly. Okay. So Java server pages, very similar. You could almost replace the Apache and PHP with Tomcat. That's what Tomcat does. Is it's instead of PHP being the language, Java is the language, and Tomcat is both the Java engine as well as the web server all in one, right? So Tomcat really would kind of take these two roles in the picture. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that in that you know, this diagram on the right kind of attempts to show it. You've got your page here that's going to be a mixture of Java code and HTML, but then Tomcat's actually going to compile that into a class and then execute the class. So PHP is a strictly interpreted on the fly kind of language, but Tomcat is going to turn that on the fly into a compiled class. So, you know, I don't know how important of a distinction that is for folks at this point, but as we get further into JSP, that will be something you'll need to keep in mind. Any questions on that?
Okay, I have a question.
Mhm.
So the Apache is basically between, you can have that running on your machine,
Mhm.
and it's, the PHP is just basically like parameters that are passed to the server, right, to get the web page, right?
Well, so let's say you're on this web browser and you've said, hey, I want web page A, right? And that request goes to the web server, which is Apache, and Apache says, okay, I know where web page A lives. It lives over here, right? And it grabs it, but that web page actually has PHP code embedded in it. And, you know, Apache is actually letting PHP go get the file, do its thing, and then it returns to Apache basically just a straight HTML page. Does that answer your question?
Okay, I was looking at the diagram wrong. That's better.
Okay. And so then, you know, what your web browser sees is just straight HTML. But what's really in that page is a mixture of HTML and PHP. Right? So this PHP thing is interpreting that stuff on the fly. And so with Tomcat over on the right-hand side, it's both the web server and that engine all rolled into a single piece of software, right? That's what Tomcat is. It fulfills both of these roles. And so you've got your web browser, that's your client. You've got Tomcat, that's your server. And then you've got this web page over here, hello.jsp. So if you say, hey, I want to see the web page hello, you know, you type that into your browser, it goes to Tomcat. Tomcat says, hey, I know where that is. It goes and gets it, but it then says, okay, I need to then compile that, you know, that I see into here into an actual executable class, and then I will execute that class, which is going to output HTML, that then goes back to the browser as HTML code.
So is Tomcat slower because of all of that?
I don't know that I've seen any comparisons in terms of speed between PHP and Tomcat. Just because PHP is interpreted, oftentimes interpreted languages are slower than compiled languages. But the difference is that this is kind of compiling on the fly. So that's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to it. Which one is faster? I'm not sure. Great question, though. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So in this particular example, they use two different classes for their model. This one should look fairly similar to the last example. It's basically just creating a POJO for the student. This one gives the student an ID, a first name, and a last name. So it's slightly different from the one we looked at before, but then it's got the getters and the setters. Then the next one is what I would describe as a helper class called student service. And basically it's the helper class then where it is, you know, setting the ID and the name for three different students. Then we're going to look at the controller next, and the controller is probably the most complicated piece of code here. So one thing you'll notice up here, you've got this @web servlet and then some stuff, and then you've got your actual Java code, right? And you'll notice that this controller student servlet extends HTTP servlet, right? So there's a lot that has to do with servlets that we haven't covered yet, and is sort of beyond the scope of what I can explain today. But basically, this controller is using that servlet pattern. And, you know, in the controller, it basically parses a request. So what this is really saying is, if I have a student ID, you know, if I have a student ID, and this request.get parameter, okay, so this is getting from the web request a variable with, or a parameter with the name of ID, right? And then it's checking, okay, if that's null, then if it's not null, then it's going to do this get student thing. And that get student thing, again, that was back in the model, right? So it's letting the model do the pieces related to getting or setting of data. And if it gets a value from that, it's going to present by setting the attribute of a request that it's then going to send to the view module. So in essence, what it's doing is this controller is accepting a web request, could be a get, could be a post, and it's getting out of there the student ID, and then it's finding out from the model the student attributes that are related to that ID, and then it's going to pass that information, it's going to put it into a request, and again, could be a get, could be a put, and it's going to send that off to the view. That's really about, I guess, as simple of an explanation as I can make to you at this point. Again, because so much of this is based off of servlet stuff that we have not covered, it's a little more difficult for me to explain exactly how all of this works. This is another one, though, where, you know, it's a fairly simple example in terms of it's not doing very much. And so that's another reason why I felt like including code that is available out there on the internet that you could go study at your leisure would be helpful. And so that's kind of why I picked this particular example. So what questions do you have about this?
I had one, but I was trying to figure out how to ask it. So is the controller pretty much, how do I put this? Is it going out, grabbing the information, and then storing it in your web browser? So if you click on another view or add some data, it's then instantaneous, or is it constantly going out and fetching your data? Does that make sense?
Well, I think so. So let me kind of walk through again how I think about it. So I think of this controller as being when you make a request. So it's accepting input essentially from a user, a web form, right? So you've got a web page. It's a view page, and it's about a student, right? And you're on that web page, and you tell it, I want to see information about student ID 1, right? So let's say there's a form on that view that where you can input the student's ID, and then you click a button that says, you know, tell me about that student. Well, the button essentially is then passing control to this controller, right? And the controller is saying, okay, do I have a student ID? That it's, you know, that ID is going to be in the request parameters coming from that view page. And then it's going to go to the model and it's going to get what it knows about that student from the model. And then it's going to set the information that it found about that student into a new request that it's then going to send back to that view. So and again, so over on the right-hand side, this is all one chunk of code. I had to put it kind of on left and right sides just because it wouldn't fit, you know, going up and down all on the same page. But it's either going to do a get or it's going to do a post. And again, if you're familiar with building web pages, whether it's PHP or some other way, I mean, get and post are sort of the two main ways of interacting with a web page. And so, again, in this example, once it has gotten the student information, it's essentially going to do a get or a post back to that view, which now is going to have updated information in those request parameters.
Makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and so, you know, this is a common model where what it's actually passing back is this thing called student record. Well, student record is actually an object, right? And buried within that object, you're going to have things like the student's first name and the student's last name, etc. Instead of passing all of those attributes as separate things, it's just passing that object, student record, to the view. So then when we look at the view, hey, look, there's HTML. Very familiar looking if you've done anything with web pages, right? But you'll notice, you know, you got these little funky brackets here. Okay, so those brackets basically are the markers for JSP that, hey, buried within here, there's some code, right? So here's some more, you know, so essentially you can see I've got an if, else, and then this would be the end piece of that statement, right? So that looks like Java, right? But the rest of this stuff is HTML. So except for, again, you've got these little markers. Anywhere you see these little markers, you should expect to see Java code. Okay, and so what this is basically saying is, if I actually did get a student record, if it's not null, then you know, get that from the web page header, right? Get the attribute from the web page and instantiate this Java object of student. And then down here, I'm going to do a get ID on that student object. I'm going to get, you know, do a get first name from that student object and a get last name. And it's going to, you know, those are basically placed right in line with HTML. So that when the Tomcat engine processes this, it's going to, again, it's going to compile all of this into an executable thing that when it executes, what's going to be output is strictly HTML, because anything that's in between these special marked brackets that results in HTML will on an output side be HTML. So at this point, it would, let's say the student record, oops, sorry about that. The student record was number 1, right? So what you would see here, instead of these brackets and stuff in the output, you would just see a 1. And let's say it was John Brown, right? So here you'd see John, here you'd see Brown. You wouldn't see these little code snippets in the output. And then this ending bracket for the if-else statement would be gone as well. So again, you know, if you haven't done anything like this previously, this probably is a little bit confusing. I'm trying to explain it as best I can. What questions do you have about this view page?
Can I ask my questions after we stop recording? Because it might
Sure.
go on for a while.
Sure. Yep. Okay, well, that's basically all I had. I mean, that's kind of the model view controller viewed from just a sort of ordinary Java interface perspective or a Java server pages perspective, kind of two different examples. And that's all.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful.
Yep. Now,
I will-
am I going to continue to record, or do you want me to?
No, stop the recording.
Okay. Oh, I stopped sharing. That's probably not the same thing.
Mhm.